So like I said, in today's lecture, I will, of course, continue talking about World War One. I will later have this lecture up, of course, on my YouTube channel. If you want to go on there, Professor Simon's History Classroom, it's called, and send me any comments, questions. I think some of you have sent some here and there, but if you got any comments, questions about the lecture, let me know about that. I don't know if anybody's on Facebook Live right now. I'm streaming on Facebook Live, but there's the link to StreamYard if you want to come in, of course. Just make sure you're logged into Facebook, of course, before you do that. So that's just for students, of course. All right. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to continue talking about, World War One. There should be, of course, a PowerPoint lecture. There should be a part 2 lecture I've got that I posted to Canvas for you to look at. Of course, I'm going to continue talking about World War One with, first of all, we're going to talk about, of course, the main thing, of course, which is the United States and how we got in the war to fight against the Germans, of course, in Europe. And a lot of it had to do with conflicts with Germany, which you'll see later. A lot of it had to do with Germans' submarine policies, that they were against the Allies. And also there was issues with Mexico. Believe it or not, Mexico was a big problem that also led to, World War One coming in. And I'll get to that. They have the Zimmerman telegram. You may have heard of our Zimmerman note. That's famous, that got us in the war. So it's one of the key issues that helps us propel us to war, which we would enter the war in April of 1917. That's when the U.S. would declare war on Germany and get in the war. We primarily fought against the Germans. If we fought against anybody else much, maybe in Italy, we may have helped them out a little bit. But anyway, So yeah, I got here, of course, a slide here. Those, of course, the main two things that really, I guess, propelled us into the war. They had the Lusitania incident, which I'll talk about first today. And I'll talk about the Zimmerman telegram was the other thing that happened as well. Let's talk about that first, which, the sinking of the Lusitania was a major incident in World War One, which caused a lot of problems for the United States. And kind of get into that, the Germans were, like I said, they were going more towards unrestricted submarine warfare. That's a case where they were sinking Allied shipping in support, because we were sending arms to help the French and the British in the war. Kind of almost like secretly, but we were, stayed as a neutral power from 1914 to 1917. And of course, the Germans had started using submarines a lot, the U-boat or undersea boot. Submarines have been around really since the 1800s, but really World War One was the first major war where submarines were really used, in warfare overall. And the Lusitania incident happened in May of 1915. Actually, I think the date's May 7th to be exact. It's actually a wrong date, but around May 7th, I think it is. That's when it left. May 1st, when the so-called RMS Lusitania, which was a famous British luxury liner, passenger ship or cruise ship, if you want to call it that left New York Harbor. You say May 1st, had about 1,900 something passengers and other crew with it. Of course, nobody thought that a submarine could sink a ship that large, as in it really had sank too many ships before, because this is the beginning of the war at this point. There's even articles in the newspaper where the Germans warned people not to get on the ship, including Americans. And of course, a German U-boat in what was the Irish Sea sunk it. I think at least one torpedo, as far as they know. Yeah, May 7th, 1915, sank in the Irish Sea. It was actually going towards, I think it was Liverpool, was the port it was going towards, and didn't make it. And around 1,200 people were killed. The ship went down real fast. I want to say like in 16 minutes, it sank fast, the ship. So very few survivors were able to get out. and about 128 Americans were actually killed. So this really angered a lot of people. In fact, the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who was under Wilson, resigned because he was angry about the whole issue. I think he wanted to go to war with the Germans, but Wilson basically held out. He decided to stay neutral, continue neutrality, the rest of the war. But they think that the German use of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Lusitania incident pretty much helped propel, the U.S. into more support towards the Allies. And of course, because of it, they led to a lot of, anti-German sentiment in the country. So, like on my father's side, I've got a lot of relatives that are German, so I can't imagine how they felt, having this war break out and all of that. In fact, none of my relatives fought in World War One. By the way, I think there was one drafted. I'll talk about later. He was drafted, but he didn't serve. So I guess he didn't want to fight against his cousins. There's some that did. There's some German Americans that actually fought, like Eddie Rickenbacker. Was a famous World War One flying ace. Was German and fought against them. So that happened sometimes. So yeah, so that's one issue, and of course, one of the things that would cause us to get in the war, that Germans for a while actually suspended their unrestricted submarine warfare. They actually gave this thing called the Sussex Pledge, where they pledged to just warn ships before sinking them. But later on, in 1918, they went back to unrestricted submarine warfare. So they're trying to blockade and, prevent, supplies getting in to support the war effort on the Allied side. And so they were kind of trying to strangle the Allies. And so that's a major, major cause, why we got in the war. Now, the other issue they have too, so there's a newspaper thing about the sinking right there. The other thing that was big was the Zimmermann telegram they had as well, which was big. That was a famous, it's called all kinds of names. Zimmermann telegram, Zimmermann note, that should be note. Also called the, I think Zimmermann cable. So it's got multiple names that they called it, but happened in early 1970, I think January, I believe it was, of 1917. Arthur Zimmermann, he was the Germany's main foreign secretary. He sent a telegram to Mexico, to some of his German ambassadors there. And apparently it was intercepted by the British. He intercepted the telegram. And in the telegram, it talked about the fact that the Germans were hoping to form some kind of alliance with the Mexicans. So, Mexico and the United States weren't getting along because of the Mexican Revolution. Remember, Pancho Villa had attacked the United States in New Mexico and all that. And they wanted Mexico to join the Central Powers and maybe attack the United States. I think part of this was part of a diversion to prevent us from getting in the war. The Germans were really concerned that if the United States got in the war, it might be a major turning point in the war, which it was. The United States is part of why the Allies won the war. Our supplies, weapons and all that, munitions and stuff we've got and manpower helped kind of turn the tide later. In the telegram, it actually said, hey, we'll actually give you military aid to try to get land back that you lost to the United States in the 1800s, like the Mexican War. You may have heard of Mexican-American War, they called it, where they lost like Arizona, New Mexico, California, and all that. And they also told me, we'll get Texas back for you too, as well. So I think I was all probably not going to happen. But anyway, it was an idea that, they came up with, to do all this. That was like really one of the last straws, between us and the Germans. And so eventually in April of 1917, Congress decided to declare war. And of course, Wilson, signed it. And so the U.S. was eventually at war with Germany, of course, in World War I. So that's how we got in the war at that point. And There were some Americans that were for it, and there's some that were kind of mad about it, which I'll talk about later, because there was still some that, wanted to basically, keep America first, over these European. A lot of people didn't want to get involved in Europeans' problems, and so on. And Woodrow Wilson said it best, that the world must be made safe for democracy. That was his quote, of course, about it. Of course, he reneged on that famous campaign slogan, if you remember correctly, in 1916, which is, "He kept us out of war." And, well, obviously, some people thought they were betrayed, because of that. I know a lot of the socialist communists didn't like it. They thought it was a capitalist war. Maybe it was, because I know a lot of industries got very wealthy off of the war itself. So, before I get into that, also another thing I need to talk about, Woodrow Wilson, talk a little bit about him. He had this thing called the 14 points that you may have heard of. She later was issued during the war, January of 1918, so-called 14 points. Really a speech that he gave, and they called it the 14 points later, but it was like a peace plan that he outlined pretty much. It was like a series of 14 principles, and the idea was to create kind of a lasting peace in Europe and to prevent world wars like this from breaking out overall. Also, the 14 points were designed to get the Germans to sue for peace early. They were hoping to try to get them to stop the war early because it already had dragged on too long, too many casualties. And a lot of average Europeans really liked his ideas, Woodrow Wilson, that were in it. And a lot of the European politicians, like in France, Britain, and other countries, were kind of skeptical about it. They thought it was too idealistic. I think, who was it? George Clemenceau of France said that it bored him. He said that Almighty God only had 10, as in the 10 commandments. So, but here's kind of you can look here, the 14 points there. Those are the one we'll get to. That's the most important one. That's, of course, famous, is the 14th one. That's the one that they pretty much settled on the most. But some of these were interesting. One was the idea of open diplomacy between different countries, where countries would use diplomacy to solve differences rather than fighting war. 2, freedom of the seas. 3, freedom of trade throughout the world. 4, arms reductions, which I think Wilson believed that the World War I had been caused by the arms race, militarism that had started before the war, that went back to the Industrial Revolution. Colonial self-determination was something else he thought about, where colonial areas should be able to form maybe independent states and all of that. 6 through 8, 6, 7, 8 were German evacuation from Russia, Belgium, France. I think like the French got Alsace-Lorraine back and all that. And so on. 9, Italian national unification, of course, was something he talked about, where all of Italy was unified. It was already kind of unified, but I think all of Italy to be unified is what he wanted. 10, Austro-Hungarians given freest opportunity as spontaneous development. Of course, that would lead to the breaking up of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary would separate. Then you'd have the formation of Yugoslavia, where you've got Croatia, Serbia, and all those countries down there as well. So all that would be broken up. That's actually part of 11. You're looking there. Of course, the realignment of the Balkans. That's Yugoslavia, basically. 12, division of Ottoman Empire. Eventually that would be broken up. Of course, it would lead to the Republic of Turkey eventually. 13, development of Poland. So a Polish country, Poland, would be created. And the most famous one, of course, he did, that's well known, is the League of Nations. That was something he created, of course. The League of Nations. Yeah, I'll actually put this right here if you don't mind. But yeah, that led to that one, the 14 points. And League of Nations was kind of like an early version of the United Nations, which formed in 1945. It's a worldwide international governmental peace organization, which the UN is today. It was created in 1920 to prevent future conflicts and to use more diplomacy between countries to prevent wars from breaking out. If you know about it, Woodrow Wilson got the Nobel Peace Prize. There's only been I think it's been like 4 presidents, I think, that have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, I think. And so he got it. And however, later it was kind of deemed weak. I know the U.S. refused to back it. That was one of the big problems they had with it. Like the U.S. didn't even want to ratify the whole Treaty of Versailles after the war, because we didn't really want to get involved in Europe's problems and all that directly. And so we didn't give enough support to it early on. And it really prevented the spread of fascism, like the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. It didn't really do much to stop those guys, of course. That was a major problem, of course, overall. So, yeah, we're talking about, Woodrow Wilson's, 14 points and all of that. So I was kind of getting into that. Let me go back. And, of course, I'm going to talk about also more about the war itself on this slide. So here's a kind of a newspaper thing proposed by Wilson about the 14 conditions or points, I guess they called it. Now, Congress passed also a draft. That's one thing that's famous, of course, about the beginning of the war for us. When we got involved in the war, Congress had the so-called Selective Service Act of 1917, which, by the way, was the first American draft in wartime, I think, that they ever had. They had some like in the Civil War and all that, but it wasn't really, we were fighting each other, in the Civil War. But so it's considered the first wartime draft. They've had several of these Selective Service Acts over the years. They had some in World War II. I think they had another one later, like the Vietnam era as well. Always, of course, all American men that were drafted were chosen through a lottery system using their birth date. That's how they pick people. And 1917, the first initial draft had American men that were 21 to 30 years old. This included not just men that were like, say, white or whatever, but I think African Americans were drafted too. I forget how many, but several hundred thousand I know served in the war as well. And then by 1918, they increased the actual draft age 18 to 45. Whew, I'm outside that range. Thank God. But my grandfather, he actually was forced to register for the draft. This was in 1918. I think I want to say he was 21. Yeah, he's 21 years old, my grandfather. However, he was in college at the time. My grandfather went to the University of Mississippi. It's also called Ole Miss. You may have heard of it, Ole Miss University. I think he was a major in pharmacy. He was a pharmacy. He was actually going to be a doctor, I believe, but for some reason it didn't pan out. I think it was something like a money problem. I think they didn't have enough money or something to send him to med school. So he ended up becoming a pharmacist instead. And but he registered for the draft, and for some reason he didn't serve. So I guess they didn't draft him, whatever. They made like 24 million men though register for it. Now think about 4 or 5 million men actually served in the war, either over here or in Europe. So roughly, I think it was like, believe it was about 2 to 3 million men actually went over there and fought in France. It was roughly, I think, so about half of them or so went over there and fought. Oh, also, this is not something in the slide, but there was also this other thing that Congress passed called the Espionage Act. I just wanted to mention about that 1917 act passed by them. This basically arrested or imprisoned anybody that was critical toward the war effort. So you had people that were against the war and didn't want to get in it. A lot of socialists and communists didn't want to get in the war. They thought it was a capitalist type war, and all of that. And there was one guy named Eugene Debs, famous American socialist, and he was actually in prison for it because he was so outspoken against us getting in the war and all of that. There was a famous, funny story about it. Like he was in prison till I want to say 1920, 21 or something like that for a bunch of years. And when he was in prison, he actually ran for president in prison, just in 1920. I forget how many votes he got, but he got a few 100,000 votes. I want to say 300,000. That's kind of funny about that. Now, of course, the United States then formed an army, which was called different names. Usually the AEF, or American Expeditionary Force, or Forces, is what they called it. That was our initial army that went over to France and fought, which wouldn't really be until 1918 before we actually got in the war itself. And General John Pershing, who we talked about numerous times, was the commander of the American forces that went over there. He commanded, of course, Blackjack Pershing, they called him, of course, most decorated general, one of the most decorated generals in American history, John Pershing. So he was our highest, commanding general in World War I. He went over there. We, of course, didn't really fight till later. Like American forces really don't fight till 1918. So early on, the AEF mostly fought alongside like French, British forces in the war in France and part of Belgium, I guess. And we actually have our own army later by 1918, which was called the first U.S. First Army. They had commanded by John Pershing. And we did fight in some battles later, like Battle of St. Michel and the Battle of the Argonne Forest, or Argonne, were really our two most famous battles we fought, which were part of the 100 Days Offensive, where the Allies drove the Germans back into Belgium. Oh, they had, you've probably heard of General Douglas MacArthur. You've probably heard of him. He was big in World War II. Very famous general. Fought in the Pacific, but in World War I, he was only a colonel. Most people know that. Called him Dugout Doug, was what his original nickname was. Yeah, Dugout Doug. And he had this division called the Rainbow Division, which they call the U.S. Army 42nd Division. It was actually a unit made up of various National Guardsmen from numerous states throughout the United States. They actually were the first soldiers to get to France and fight in like the end of 1917. So they got there first, started fighting with the French and others. And they were called the Rainbow Division because they had this rainbow patch that they wore on their shoulder, which was a logo that represented all the different states that they were from, that they fought with, and all that. By the way, U.S. soldiers that fought in World War I were either called Yanks or Yankees. You know about that. Of course, a Yankee to me is somebody in the northern United States. The South, we're not Yankees. Anyway, we're the ex-Confederates and all the rebels, whatever you want to call us. The Yanks. The Yanks are Yankees, of course. And Doughboy, of course, Doughboy was of course, a nickname. They called him a lot because that's kind of a theory about where that came about, the nickname, but because they ate bread a lot. That was a lot of their main food they ate, I know. And also, I think the buttons on their jackets or uniforms look like a donut. Is that like a hole in it or something like that? But like I said, U.S. strength doesn't really get enough forces over there to fight with the Allies till the spring of 1918. But I think by that time, we got 2 million troops or more that eventually get over there fighting the war. And it's a major reason why the Germans end up losing the war because of U.S. involvement and all that. Now, I did want to get into and talk about also the Germans. The Germans, of course, would attempt an offensive in the war. I'll kind of get into that. I'll talk about Alvin York a little later. But the Germans would attempt this. They attempted a final offensive in the West, which was called different names. I think they call it either the Spring Offensive or the Operation Michael. It was named after the angel Saint Michael. The Michael, the Archangel, one of those things, Michael, I think it was. Yeah, I think it is. And they're hoping to offset the fact that the United States was bringing in fresh troops. So this is going to be a big problem. They knew in 1918. And also the other thing that happened too, about World War I, was that Eastern Front, the Germans didn't have to fight anymore. because Russia had the Russian Revolution break out 1917, where the Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown. And then within a few months, what happened was the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. It would later lead to the Russian Civil War, which was really bloody. And then out of that, you get the Soviet Union that forms, which Soviet Union ends up being a communist state that'll be a rival to America and other powers later, especially in World War II, the Cold War era, and all that. And so they didn't have to worry about the Russians because they had dropped out of the war. The Russians, I think, actually sued for peace separately with the Germans in what was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was signed, I think, in Poland. So that's why they came with Operation Michael, which happened in the spring of 1918. And what happened was the German forces actually literally drove back the Allies many miles, mostly in the northern part of France, north of Paris. And they formed bulges or salients in the Allied lines. In some cases, in some places, 40 miles deep at one point. Looked like the Germans might break through. But evidently the Germans stopped the offensive in April. So that's when what happened was they had one more offensive too, which was second Battle of the Marne, which was really in the summer of 1918, was really the last major, last offensive that the Germans would actually attempt at that point. That was a total failure too. They tried multiple offensives to try to break the Allied lines before the Americans, I guess, got there in full, and that really became one of our first major battles that we really fought in the war. Second Battle of Marne. We suffered 45,000 casualties just in that conflict right there overall. Now, the conflict that would really end the war, though, was the 100 Days Offensive, which lasted about 100 days. It lasted from about August 8th to November 11th, 1918. And this offensive, what happened was the British, the French, and the Americans combined their forces to attack what is called the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was the main German defensive line on the Western Front that they had established in 1917. It was there in 1917, 1918. And out of those troops, about 2 million American troops participated in the 100 Days Offensive. It's the most strategic aspect of the war. And battles like St. Michel was one battle where we participated in that one. And of course, the one that's the more famous one that everybody talks about, of course, in American history, is the Battle of the Argonne, or Argonne Forest. They also call it the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It's also another Meuse-Argonne battle. It's called all kinds of names, which took place mostly around October of 1918. And this was a major thrust through what is called the Argonne Forest, which is in the northern part of France. And the Allies were trying to break the Hindenburg Line, and then they were going to try to push the Germans back out of France. And they would. October, November, the German forces suffer heavy casualties, and they're driven back into Belgium at that point. The Americans suffered a lot of casualties in this battle, the Argonne battle, 130,000 total would be about right, about how many men we would sustain wise. It was really considered the second bloodiest battle in American history. Really, the bloodiest was Battle of the Bulge in World War II, 1944-45. And 26,000 Americans were killed in the battle. I think Battle of the Bulge was 39,000 Americans killed, which is a lot. And so you got the Civil War, Antietam and all that, but that's, like I said, us fighting each other, in that battle. I don't know if you really count that one because we're fighting somebody like a foreign power. The Argonne battle is known for men like Alvin York. You may have heard about Sergeant Alvin York. He was really the most decorated American soldier in World War I that fought in the war. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor and all of that. And York is famous for his heroics, where he took out a whole unit of German forces, almost by himself. like single-handedly. Apparently they were being cut down by several machine gun nests, and York decided to basically storm it. I think he took some men with him too, not just himself. And he was able to kill himself like 35 Germans, like single-handed. I think he did himself, killed 35 Germans. It's like Rambo, back in those days, basically. Captured 122 prisoners by himself. I think it was an old joke that some general said, hey, you're going to defeat the whole German army by yourself? That kind of thing. So Alvin York became a real big hero, after the war. They even made movies about him, like Gary Cooper, if you know about it, starred in the movie Sergeant York. And so he was a very famous person, of course, in World War I. So it's kind of talking about, Alvin York. And here's another slide on York. So he was one of the most famous of the doughboys and all that. He actually was a objector of the war. I think when they first drafted him, he was like, he didn't want to fight. I think he was a Quaker. You study about Alvin York. And there was a joke about this. It was kind of funny, but he was like being trained, going through like the military training for war. And he told one of his officers, said, killing, training to kill somebody is against my religion, is what he basically said. But he eventually changed his mind and, became one of the most, like I said, decorated soldiers, of course, in American history. There's also that story about Charles Whittlesey. I don't know if you ever heard about him. He was another guy that was kind of against the war, Consti's objector as well. And he was involved in what they call the Lost Battalion. It's a very famous story that happened also in the Battle of the Argonne Forest. Lost Battalion was actually called the 77th Division of the American Army. And what happened was they got surrounded by German forces in the Argonne battle. And they lost communication with headquarters about what was going on. And I think the division had about 9 companies in it and had like 500-600 men in it. And what happened was to get communication to the outside and get help, they sent pigeons, homing pigeons, out. And there was one that got through that was called cher ami, which means in French, dear friend. And it actually made it, and they were able to get reinforcements and save the unit. And the division, I think, lost 2/3 of it, though. Only one third of the actual men survived in the Lost Battalion. But that's what they called it. And they've made movies about that, too. I think it's a really good movie called The Lost Battalion. Well, they made a TV series about it, too, I believe. It may have been called that as well. So anyway, this kind of talking about that. Now, of course, we need to get into also and talk about the end of the war, what happened. And yeah, the Germans, like I said, they got driven back into Belgium by the end of the war. So the Germans started losing the war. A lot of their troops were suffering heavily from the Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic that I made you watch about that documentary. And so it actually affected their forces more than I think on the Allied side. The Allied side suffered too, but not as bad on the German side. Also, they were lacking a lot of veterans, so a lot of their best soldiers had been killed in the war or wounded. That was a problem. Also, they had revolutions, I think, I want to say about that time, breaking out. They had the German Revolution broke out in Germany, of course, which eventually overthrows the Kaiser's government pretty much. And so the German military stepped in and just decided to surrender and end the war. And so the Germans surrendered to the Allies on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. So that's basically, what happened with that. And so unofficially, the armistice is what ended World War I. So there's kind of a, like I said, basically that's, about when, the war ends pretty much, although it doesn't really officially end the war. What really ends the war is the Treaty of Versailles. We go in, the Germans signed it, because if Germans wouldn't have signed it, they would have got invaded or occupied after the war. The actual armistice was signed in a railway car in the Forest Compiègne, is in France. And that, of course, became later known as Veterans Day in America, November 11th. And then in Europe, they still call it Remembrance Day as well. So every year, of course, people honor the end of the war. Of course, Veterans Day has now become, pretty much for all veterans. And don't confuse that with Memorial Day, which is for veterans that have died in wars past and all that. So, yeah, they had the end of the war that came later. And they had what they call the Paris Peace Conference that followed, which occurred from about a 6-month period from January to June of 1919. All the Allied powers that had, won the war, they basically met to discuss the peace terms of the war, which were, if you know about it, dictated to the Germans. Germans really didn't have a say in anything that went into the Treaty of Versailles, of course, later. And the 4 countries that were mostly dominant at the proceedings of the Paris Peace Conference, of course, were the United States, France, Great Britain, and also Italy, which was kind of minor, not as important. They were on the winning side, but they weren't as big. Really should be called the Big Three. Because really the first 3, U.S., Britain, and France, were the main ones that really dictated that went into it. The Big 4 representatives that were at the conference, I have a picture of that to show you. Think of that. The 4 that were there. So yeah, the war's over at that point. Huns have been defeated and all that. There's that little thing about the armistice and all that. But 32 countries, of course, participated in the Paris Peace Conference overall. Yeah, those are the 4 men there. So you got Vittorio Orlando, you got Woodrow Wilson, you've got David Lloyd George, George Clemenceau. So those are all the 4 main representatives, of course, that, ruled, I guess, their countries at the time. Pretty much they were there for the peace, the pie, at the end of the war and all of that. So George was the prime minister of Britain. Clemenceau was I guess he was the prime minister too, I guess, of France. Vittorio Orlando was the prime minister of Italy. And then, of course, the United States had the President Woodrow Wilson that was there. Orlando really didn't do much. I think Orlando was mostly there because he wanted part of where northern Italy is, like the northeastern part. He was trying to expand Italy and take part of what was Austro-Hungarians' leftover empire. That's all they wanted. And also on the Adriatic. They wanted part of the Adriatic as well because they wanted ports there, all that. So that's mostly what Italy was into it for overall. But they didn't do much, Italy. So yeah, Italy should be called the Big Three. Because U.S., Britain, France, really the ones that dominated the whole thing. And they would, of course, set the agenda that went into the Treaty of Versailles. And, of course, that was eventually signed, if you know about it, in the famous Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919. Notice the date there, June 28, 1919, is the same 5-year anniversary, if you know about it, of when the Archduke was shot. Yeah, that's the date they signed it on, which is very interesting. And pretty much the treaty, like I said, was dictated to the Germans. What went into it, you basically signed here, is what they told the Germans and all that. So what was actually in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919? Of course, if you know about it, the Treaty of Versailles is one of the major causes of why World War II happens. The Germans were furious about it. If you know about Adolf Hitler, pretty angry about what went in the treaty. Pretty much it punished the Germans and pretty much took whatever from them that they could, whether it be money, colonies and territory from them in Europe. And like the Germans lost control of like a lot of their colonies that were around the world, like in the Africa, the Pacific. Alsace-Lorraine went to the French. They also lost part of Germany, which went to Czechoslovakia as well. Part of Poland went to what Poland gets, of course. Like I think the western part of Poland also was taken from the Germans as well. So all those territories are taken at that point. The Germans also were given responsibility for the war, like why it broke out. Maybe they didn't really cause the war to break out. I think most think Austria-Hungary was the one that really caused the war to break out. But Germans were seen as the aggressors in World War I. That's the problem. And so they were forced to sign what is called Article 231, which was the war guilt clause, where they accepted responsibility for being one of the powers that helped cause the war in the first place. So it's like psychological, trying to put it on the Germans. Then also they took most of their armed forces away. They had made them sink all their U-boats, and a lot of their took away a lot of their Navy and their Air Force as well. So all that was taken away by the Germans. By the Allied side. They could only have an army of about 100,000 men as a defensive force, predominantly. Of course, the Germans would break that later, about that, by the 1930s under Hitler. The big thing was that they had to pay war reparations. About $32 billion had to be paid, a lot. So that would take them a long time to actually pay it. I don't know if you know that, but they eventually paid it off. When was that, 10 years ago or so? Or something like that. They finally paid it off. Most people don't know that. The Germans did eventually pay all the war reparations off they owed. I know Hitler refused to pay it for a while. I know, but they kept paying them through the Cold War and all that. So one more other things about the war, too, which are famous. Of course, not as much in like American history is important, but one thing about the war that is famous, the war did create a lot of new countries in Europe after the war. Czechoslovakia and Poland formed. Of course, Poland had been a country before. It reformed. Of course, again, Finland was also created. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania kind of became like more independent states at that point. Yugoslavia formed as a country, which would be around until the Cold War. It would later break up, of course, and you've got Croatia, Serbia, etc., Bosnia, which are now countries that are what was once Yugoslavia as well. Austria and Hungary were separated as countries as well. And of course, Turkey would form. Republic of Turkey, if you know about it, would form a few years later after that, which is more in Middle East, but it pretty much formed because the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the war. And pretty much all the major empires that were around pretty much collapsed. Like the Russian Empire collapsed, Ottoman Empire collapsed. The French Empire was kind of collapsed too, I guess, because the French kind of were beaten up by the war. So I think only the British monarchy was still around in their empire. So casualties of the war. Yeah, they've always talked about that too, about World War I. Of course, yeah, close to 8 or 9 million soldiers died in World War I on both sides combined. That's a lot in history up to that point so far. That would be, of course, increased even more by World War II. Forget how many soldiers died in World War II, but it's got to be triple that, that died in the war overall. Total of 20 million deaths, so they think if you add in civilian deaths and stuff like that as well. I think the wounded was like 20 million wounded, or something. I don't forget how many wounded it was, but I think it was double the amount or something that were actually wounded in the war overall. And of course, we've already talked a little bit about the Spanish influenza. That, of course, was something that happened too at the end of World War I from 1917 to about 1919. There was this, awful influenza pandemic that spread throughout the world, which there's a documentary that I want y'all to watch on that. If you've already started on that already. And it killed over 600,000 Americans, between 1917 and 1919. And of course, in the documentary, it talks about how it started somewhere in the Midwest, then spread to Europe. And then from Europe, it spread all the way around the world, killing maybe, like I said, 50 million people may have died from influenza at one point. It's not as bad as bubonic plague, which I think killed 100 million like in ancient times, medieval times. They think it killed almost 1% of the U.S. population, at least not quite, but it may have been close to that amount, which at the time, the U.S. population was about 100 to 110 million people, population-wise. So our population now is like 3 times bigger than that overall. So, like, the coronavirus has killed, like, I think 200 to 300,000, I know, in the United States. But it's not even close percentage-wise compared to what the influenza one was. It was like 10 times worse, really, the Spanish flu. If you look at the population numbers and how many people died, from it. Spain had 8 million deaths. Whoa, that's a lot. And then India had like 20 million, or something like crazy number like that. So that's like half of them right there that they had. It's a lot that died in Spain. I don't know if that number's really right or not, but that's what I've heard. It's some crazy number that died in Spain because of it. Now, one more thing I can talk about as well. Of course, what happened after the war and all of that. Of course, the Treaty of Versailles, you see right here, that's the final, of course, picture right there, slide about that, of course. You want to look at that late. 33 billion is about, like I said, dictate. Yeah, it was dictated to them, basically, more or less. You want to look at this map here. That shows you like post-World War I Europe after the war. You can see all those new countries that were built up between like the Soviet Union and Germany. It's going to be ripe for Hitler to come in and take all that, up to like World War II. That's the bad thing about that. It creates all these weak countries that the Nazis eventually overrun over time. The Soviets later come back, the Cold War, and overrun it themselves the other way. But one thing that's famous about the end of the war was that the United States rejected the Treaty of Versailles. We refused to actually ratify it. There was a case where we actually it went before like the U.S. Senate, and a lot of the U.S. Senate was controlled by a Republican majority at the time, and so they basically refused to, ratify it and all of that, and so that became a big problem. It was Henry Cabot Lodge. I think he was the majority leader, in the Senate. He was one of the guys that was kind of against it because he didn't want the United States to get involved in Europe's problems at the time. And so what Woodrow Wilson did, he went on this speaking tour of the United States to get support for it, including not just ratifying the Treaty of Versailles. He was trying to get support for his idea of the League of Nations, which was the 14th point and all of that. And what happened was he was so engaged in trying to do this that Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke and became basically incapacitated for the rest of his, time in office, and so he became an invalid from 1919 to 1921. So that kind of ended the whole Woodrow Wilson era. It's kind of ended on a kind of a whimper, at the end, and all of that. So it was kind of sad what happened with that. They didn't have the 25th Amendment at the time, so they couldn't have him removed, and all of that. And so if you know about it, his wife, the First Lady, Edith Wilson, actually is the one that ran the White House practically. Most people don't know that. People think, oh, we've never had a female president. Well, we kind of did, running the country under her. So that's something that's kind of well known about that. That's part of why they later developed the 25th Amendment, and all that and what happened with FDR and running, too long, I guess, and all that. But so that's kind of how the war ended for us, the United States. I'll, of course, get to it later, but of course, the United States is going to later get into like a post-war depression. We'll of course talk about that later. I don't think I'm going to do that today, lecture-wise, but on I think Thursday's class, I'm going to review. I'll spend some time reviewing on World War One because I don't think we've really done any review at all. So I'll go ahead and spend some time reviewing for that, and then I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about on Thursday. We're going to get into the 1920s. Now, they call it later the Roaring 20s and all that. So that's going to be the next thing I'll get to next. And so I think that's it for today, lecture-wise. Of course, don't forget, like I said, about various assignments that you need to complete. I talked about all those different Canvas quizzes that you need to kind of work on right now. So go ahead and start, trying to wrap the old ones up and get to the new ones that I've got posted right now. I am going to post this lecture later on to my YouTube channel, like I always do. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope y'all are doing okay out there. I guess the hurricanes didn't affect you too much, hopefully, overall. But let me know comments, any kind of comments, questions. Let me know any kind of questions or comments you have, of course, about this lecture on World War One or any other kind of lecture I've had before. So y'all have a good evening. I'll see you later Thursday when I post another lecture. Okay, so that's it for today.